Tess. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Kia ora koutou. I'm Aaron Glass, an anthropologist on the faculty here at the Bard Graduate Center, and I'd like to welcome both our regulars and our visitors, both those of you in flesh and those of you streaming online, to this seminar in our series, Indigenous Arts in Transition, and indeed to our final evening seminar of the academic year. For those of us joining remotely, you're invited to participate in the Q&A afterwards by tweeting your queries to #BardGradCenterTV. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Lenape Delaware people on whose traditional territory we are gathered tonight. Now, I'm extremely pleased and honored to welcome Dr. Paura John Tohi Toirurangi Tapsell to the Bard Graduate Center. Paul Tapsell, as he's known more commonly internationally, is currently the chair of Māori Studies at the University of Otago in New Zealand, having formerly held positions as curator of the Rotorua Museum of Art and History from 1990 to 94, and as the first director Māori of the Auckland Museum from 2000 to 2008. Of Te Arawa and Ngati Rokawa descent, he is widely recognized as a major contributor to the fields of anthropology, art history, museum studies, cultural heritage, and indigenous studies. With a BA and MA in social anthropology from the University of Auckland and a doctorate in museum ethnography from Oxford University, Professor Tapsell weds theoretical sophistication and curatorial acumen to his historical vision, his ethnographic sensitivity to local detail, and his activist commitment to contemporary Maori cultural and political vitality. It's a testament, I would say, to his considerable skill as a cultural analyst, translator, and diplomat, that in the 1990s, while still a graduate student, he was instrumental in the repatriation of Pukaki, a national iconic taonga, an ancestrally charged belonging, to his tribe in Rotorua from the Auckland Museum, his future employer. Tapsell's professional profile includes membership in a vast number of tribal, educational, and governmental organizations, trusts, and committees at both local and national levels, and he's held prestigious academic fellowships in New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. Beyond his work for the Rotorua and Auckland museums, his curatorial achievements include research and organization of two important traveling exhibitions: Kotawa, Maori Taonga from Our Ancestral Landscapes, which was accompanied by extensive print, media, television, and educational components, and more recently, Te Ara, Maori Pathways of Leadership, which traveled to venues in Canada, Poland, Germany, and the UK. In June 2013, he helped launch Maori Maps, an online resource for connecting both local and diasporic Maori to their ancestral territories, for which he was nominated to represent New Zealand at the World Summit Awards for Digital Innovation. As a scholar, Tapsell has focused his research on the complementary fields of archaeology and cultural heritage management, the ethnography of global museums, both as repositories for Taonga and as producers of intercultural knowledge, and indigenous entrepreneurship, Maori leadership values, and geographical and genealogical mapping of the landscape. In addition to exhibition catalogs and scores of journal articles and book chapters, he is the author of Pukaki, A Comet Returns from 2000, and The Art of Taonga, 2011. My own introduction to Tapsell's scholarship came when I was a graduate student, when I was first assigned his 1997 article, The Flight of Pareiro Tutu, an investigation of Taonga from tribal perspective, published in the Journal of Polynesian Society. While narrating the repatriation of an ancestral dogskin cloak, this magisterial essay also traced the complicated global trajectories of Maori objects, provided a trenchant critique of over a century of anthropological analyses of the category of Taonga, and performed a Maori ethno-aesthetics and museum politics from the situated and hereditary location of its author. I now assign this article to my own graduate students. His talk tonight, entitled Post-Musings from the Edge, Being an Indigenous Curator in Pacific Paradise, returns to this inaugural essay and this particular taonga in the context of his recent curatorial projects. Please join me in welcoming to the Bard Graduate Center, Dr. Paul Tapsell.
Ko te mea tuatahi, te kōrero ti matamaku ki tō tātou kāinga. Nā reira, E ngai tua marae maha o tēnei whenua. O te tangata o Delaware, haere, haere, haere. Haere ki Hawaii nui, Hawaii roa. Hawaii pamamau I honi te wairua. Haere a te rā. My first words I give to the Creator, but in so doing I also acknowledge the Delaware people. Though not seen, are still felt. And secondly, e ngā rangatira o tēnei whare wānanga, Dean Miller, Aaron and your colleagues, tēnā koutou. Ngā mihi kia koutou mo tēnei hui hui rā o tēnei whenua. To those who are the leaders here, Dean Miller, I thank you very much for the opportunity to come to the Bard Graduate Centre and provide a perspective from across the Pacific. But as Tyson continues to remind us, we all belong to the same planet, however small it might look in this universe. Finally, e ngā mana e ngā reo, e ngā mātā waka, tēnā koutou. To those of you of authority, to those of you who are eloquent speakers, to those of you who've come from the four winds upon the many waka canoes of this planet to be here tonight, my greetings. Kia ora. Right, got the formal stuff out of the way. That was for back home, just in case they say, hey, what are you doing over there? But I say that lightly, but at the same time, I'm very much appreciative of what we call wairua, the spiritual presence of the Delaware people. I've come to New York many times and always look to see if there's evidence of their existence still somehow permeating back through this landscape of concrete and confusion, explosion of ideas, opportunity and constraints. And for someone who comes from the other side of the Pacific, when I first arrived here as a very young person, it was bright lights, not much different from what it felt like, no doubt, to my parents' generation when they left our villages in search of bright lights. But for them, the huge expanse of crossing the planet was 200 or even 100 miles up the road to the big city. And to go across the Tasman Ocean to find work in Sydney or other places in Australia, that was like travelling to the other side of the universe. So my time, when I had the opportunity to come to New York and experience arguably the biggest light polluter on the planet, I was bedazzled by the experience, and it's never left me, just that feeling of wonder, but also that feeling of where are the First Nations people. But that's just a little bit of musings from a podium of an opportunity to speak to you. What I'm providing today is a PowerPoint of some family pics. That's my great-great-grandmother. So I wear her taonga, her earpiece today, in her memory. She died at the Battle of Otago fighting the British in 1864, 150 years ago. So this year is my year to commemorate her along with her 3,500 descendants. So, special insofar as she provides the female space amongst our people that is often missing when we think about tribe. Too often the colonial intersections have been male defined, and we forget that the very first interactions between two cultures were often through marriages, and the children of those marriages were empowered by their mother's father, as well as the mother, as well as the aunties. And my journey, very much since I was born, has been defined by her presence, insofar as my great aunties have forever been around to remind me, and will continue to remind our younger people coming through, of the value systems and the principles that we might call custom, you might call tradition. But as one of my aunties once said, difference between custom and tradition is something waiting to be broken. So hopefully I'm not breaking too many traditions tonight. So I think we'd better set a little bit of context, and I'll probably go fairly rapidly. If I leave anyone behind, then we can jump in at the end, and we'll find a way to talk through some of those concepts. Bottom right is the takarangi spiral. That's our motif, our emblematic way of describing the universe. Think of it as the finger of Adam reaching out to the finger of God. To us, right at that point is the point of creation, and all of our carvings will have that quietly placed within them, symbolizing the beginning of life, but also the beginning of consciousness, the bringing together of Sky Father, Earth Mother. The picture up on the left is one of my beloved elders from the 1990s who almost physically threw me out the door when I said I wanted to stay behind and be on the benefit to talk to the old people. He said, "You're not going to stick around and watch me die, you're going to go to university and you get over to Oxford and do what you're meant to do." So he was a wonderful inspiration, but reminded us as young people, or myself in particular, that we mustn't miss the opportunities to gather knowledge from wherever it might be available through whatever skill sets you have been endowed. For what reason? To be of service to your people, to come home. So a big part of my academic career or my professional museum career has always been about service back to those who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. Now it's my turn to share their love to a new generation coming through, not unlike me, don't believe in themselves. And we'll go a little bit further into the story soon. The right-hand side is the whakapapa, or the genealogy. It's starting about 30-odd, 40-odd generations back, and it brings us down to a time from the islands into New Zealand. So I provide that as our way of timekeeping. So our reference points, keeping time as genealogical, rather than clock or dates or calendars. So I might look at that and say, in the time of Oho Mairangi, the art of carving double-hulled waka came to the Pacific, and his great-great-grandson, Haumai Tawhiti and then Tamati Kapua, were voyagers, and Tamati Kapua was the ancestor that came to New Zealand, Aotearoa as we call it today. My tribe calls it Te Ika Maui, the fish of Maui, the great trickster of the Pacific. And he brought with him round about 100 of our community, and they came to live in a place called the Bay of Plenty today, but we back then knew that as Waiariki, and the landing point is Makutu, which is the fishing village in which my father grew up on the coast. And then they spread inland in the time of Rangitihi to the lakes of the Bay of Plenty region. And in those lakes, we came to be populous. And the Rangitihi had 8 children, 7 sons and a daughter. And the Te Aroa people, our tribe, descends from those 8 children. And the fellow on the left, I refer to him as the one in the middle, the carved one with the cloak, as koro, or grandfather. And he is a carving that belonged in our meeting house and has had his own trajectory as an ancestor, a Taonga, a revered ancestor, captured in carving through time. He was carved back in the 1870s and lived in the central part of our meeting house. And then in the 1940s, he was transferred, or 1920s, he was transferred to another meeting house. And then later on, he came to be in an exhibition called Tawa. To understand Māori society, we need to understand the landscape and how it's animated by the ancestors. So trying to get that message across to our children today proves rather difficult unless you can put them into that landscape. So as a young person, I was fortunate to, for example, stand where this lake is looking back to the mainland and have an elder say to me, when you were young, you went across this lake and made war. He was talking about me 300 years earlier. He was putting me into the shoes of my ancestors. He was very much making it first person so that you have this emotional shift in your understanding of the past so that you're personally present, you become animated within the landscape, and through doing that, you never forget. And with that, you'll be provided the knowledge of the whakapapa, or the genealogy, through what genealogical lines you have descended. So on the left is from Rangitihi above. We come down the left-hand side to Hene Tūrama, the picture we saw on the opening slide, my great-great-grandmother. Down the right, we come to the image of my great-great-grandfather, and then their children married, and then we come down to the genetic oddity called me. So Hene Tūrama and Tohi Tūrangi, whose name I carry. And at the bottom, as is with all our stories, is a taonga, a mnemonic aid to the past. So this taonga happens to be the right forearm of bone of this upper arm of an ancestor called Muri Rangaranga, who right at this spot here, or across the lake a little bit, he was performing a prayer. I'm cutting a big long story short, but there's a book upstairs you can read if you want. He was performing a prayer, he didn't get it right. The father of the boy who was performing the prayer, the baptism rites over, killed him and then fashioned a bone flute out of his arm. That bone flute was transferred from, on the right-hand side, from Whakaue to Tūtanakai to right down through to Tohi Te Urarangi. And then it was presented to a land agent in due course, but the trajectory continued. So our rituals, our practices, our belief systems, our behaviours, our knowledge, the transfer of these things, our genealogies, how to navigate, how to build, occurred within sites like this up in the Pacific. Up to 3,000 years old, these Marai-like or plaza-like sites, known as atia, with a ritualised ahu on the left, or like an altar, can still be seen in the Pacific, but the only place that they're still, the Marai culture that was associated, the practice associated with these venues is still practiced, the only place is in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the image on the right, another mnemonic aid, a greenstone nephrite weapon, but said to be originally fashioned from the block of stone collected by one of our ancestors when they first came to Aotearoa, New Zealand, from which these great carved canoes were created. When we came to Aotearoa, our marae started to transform, and we began to sculpture, engineer hillsides so that they looked like the temples from the islands we'd left. And we referred to them pa, or papa, or pākainga, or papakainga, or more commonly, marae atia. And for us, the marae, there's over 800, or around 800 of them. These are the central plazas of these kin communities, scattered across the countryside in strategic positions in terms of resources, rivers, lakes, ocean, land. And up until the arrival of the British, they remained the centres of our universe in that shape, as you can see right now. Through the 19th century, these village sites that were carved out of soil into these massive earthworks transformed into carved meeting houses, in a way reflecting the incoming colonists, their churches. So recognising the power that churches represented, we replicated that in the other direction, as holding on to our culture fast, but we needed a place for hospitality to look after all those who are visiting each of our marae locales due to the crisis of colonization, the crisis of war. And this marae is situated on my great-great-grandmother's other side of her genealogy and was a place of recognition during the land wars. So we think about Marai as being, apart from centres of the universe, domains of cross-generational leadership, a place where the vision and values of the rangatira, the leader, are seen not in terms of 1 or 2 generations ahead, but up to 10 generations ahead. What will you do in your time that will put your people in a better position and on a trajectory into the future in terms of trusteeship, service, and protection? So that's the marae on our, the meeting house on our marae in our village back home. Te Papaeauru is the name of the marae in the meeting house. Tama Te Kapua, named after the ancestor that sailed the double-hulled canoe from Hawaii, the homeland, spiritual homelands of our people, to New Zealand, around about 1300 AD. Up top left, you can get an idea of the extent of the sculpturing of the landscape when we talked about turning them into temples. That's commonly known as maunga kere, and at the middle part of the 3 craters is the central village of Hikurangi, and was the stronghold of the Auckland tribe of Ngāti Whātua. But then on the arrival of the British and inviting them to form a government in Auckland, they then moved, lower picture, set up their marae to be very close to their trading partners and to the opportunities and the agency that the incoming British and colonists provided to the kin group. So strategic leadership decisions. The person on the right, Sir Hugh Kāwharu, was the direct descendant of those who signed that treaty in the 1840s. And he's there standing and with his people behind him in a marae ceremony just before his passing in 2005. Some of those marae and the communities around them have ceased to exist and are now disappearing. Why? 20th century, post-World War II, offered new opportunities economically to our people. 3 generations like that, 2 world wars in which Māori still participated. As recently explained, they were willing to pay the price to prove their citizenship within New Zealand through the treaty they signed in 1840. And despite that, when they came back from those wars, they still couldn't drink in the bars or pubs alongside those who they had fought and those whom they had died alongside during those warfare, those encounters overseas. In the 1950s, 1960s, the industrial booming agricultural nation of New Zealand, the expansion of the cities, saw tens of thousands of our young people, my father's generation, go to the cities, attracted not only by the big lights, but also fleeing from the very real poverty that their communities had been enduring since the 1860s. And that, in the background there again, you can see another massive carved volcanic cone turned into a temple-like marae or pa from former days. And with the flight, we have the collapse of those rural communities in particular. And we're now into our 4th generation of living away from home. And for those in anthropology, you'll no doubt understand 3 generations. You have the breakdown of the transfer of knowledge from grandparent to grandchild. If there's no transfer there, the likelihood of that son of that grandchild having, or daughter having access to the knowledge of their great-grandparents is very limited. And if they do have access, it may well be in form of written, what's been captured in writing, which is not necessarily the same as being transferred knowledge in the first person. One of the biggest challenges we have is the continuing practice of death. So we have had to alter our death rituals, our mourning ceremonies drastically, but the essence underneath the custom, the maintaining of the principles and the values that pre-contact death rituals represented are still there today in the death rituals we practice. The only thing starting to become missing are the young people participating in these rituals to see what happens and how it happens. This is a unique situation where you can see all generations participating, not in the death ritual per se, but in the unveiling ritual a year later that formally represented the lifting of the bones of the ancestor, scraping them, dressing them in red ochre, fine mats and fine cloaks, and then after the appropriate ceremonies, they would be then taken off and hidden in the landscape in caves alongside Taonga, alongside the ancestral representations carved in wood, bone or stone, alongside the ancestral representation that's been woven and is protecting and cloaking the most recent ancestor to join the other side of the veil. That's my son at his grandfather's unveiling. And it was a big moment for him, a sad one. So to step across into this other value system you might be a little bit more familiar with. Within a New Zealand context, the museums still represent a sense of empire and colonial presence, but they're trying to move into a post-colonial space. Ultimately, the Treaty of Waitangi can't be avoided, the treaty in which Māori invited the British Crown to join in partnership in the formation of the nation of New Zealand. And within that treaty, there were promises made, not least the promise by the Crown to protect the chieftainship, the rangatiratanga, of the chiefs over their lands, their kāinga, Marai, and their Taonga, all those things they valued passed down from the ancestors. The British decided to see it differently. For them, the treaty was about Māori ceding sovereignty. It was about Māori giving the British the right to govern over them, kawanatanga, and it was about the imposition of law. The law, LAW, over and above custom, LORE, tikanga, as we would call it. And the museums became the citadels of that colonial expansion. 66 million acres of land in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Today, between 3 and 4 million acres still in our control. Most of that marginal land. And the devastation of those confiscations, both through warfare, but in particular through legislation of the Māori native land courts, ultimately pitting brother against brother. The Crown was very clever at giving lesser chiefs access to more lands than those who were in service of the whole tribe. And we had a major breakdown in our kinship social structure during the late 19th century. So what we have today is a nation speaking past each other. On the left-hand side, a fantastic moment for our tribe, the moment when Pukaki, thanks Aaron for the introduction on that, came home. I just want to point out, he wasn't repatriated, he came home on his own. We did what he told us to do. And then in due course, he's gone back into a museum, so, but we still have control. What we did was, as soon as he was returned home in I'll back up a little, just a bit of backstory. 1877, we were trying to prevent colonisation from ripping our tribe to pieces. We presented Pukaki to the Crown on the promise that the Crown would make sure our lands and our control over our resources, geothermal in particular, always remained in our control. Soon after, an agreement was made. So my tribe of Te Aroha is the only tribe that has its own treaty over and above the Treaty of Waitangi. In fact, our tribe didn't sign the Treaty of Waitangi. We didn't think we needed it. And then within our treaty, we sought to get the guarantee from the government that they would protect the geothermal, so it was always there for everyone to use, as well as the cold water springs, hot water springs, that we would gift over 1,000 acres of reserves for the use and benefit of all those who would like to come to this area to be set up as an international spa, that the land on which the township was built will always remain in the ownership of our tribe, and that the Crown would pay lease monies to us to maintain that land, and they would maintain the overall renting of the land. That schooling would continue to be available to all, that we'd have free hospital care forever after, and that we would have 1 seat out of 3 seats in the establishment of the town board, the government of the local district. Well, suffice to say, within 10 years of signing that treaty, pretty much all of that was gone. We referred to it as a Magna Carta, we still do, and I'm now one of the negotiators sitting down with the Crown, and only last week the Crown again said they don't recognise our treaty. So we're still, 100 and something years later, still fighting the fight that my great-great-grandfather did, and my great-grandfather, my grandfather, and my father, who passed away in 2007. So it continues on and on. So sometimes having a long memory can be painful. And at the right-hand side, that was a function at the Auckland Museum, a bit like what you'd have over at the Met, where you have all those wealthy patrons attend and have a few drinks, and kind of an exhibition's open. Director will have a few too many drinks and give us a very interesting speech. And the head of the board, we've had far too many drinks, and somewhere along the line we've all had too many drinks, and then the exhibition is open and we go wandering through, stumbling through. So there's very two different contrasting audiences we have. But every once in a while, those audiences come together. And at the top there, this was very recent, was the, thanks Shiloh for the photo, there's a very recent celebration, commemoration of Anzac. 100 years ago, our grandfathers fought shoulder by shoulder with the European Pākehā New Zealanders, and fought alongside them, died alongside them, were injured alongside them, and we forged, you could say, a sense of nationhood in that major conflict in which many of our people died, Māori and Pākehā. So that 100-year commemoration occurred where? Down at our Marai, and the whole town came down there. Recognition that our village is still the epicentre of our district. So, hope yet. All right, I'll jump to the cloak, pare rautatu, and the analogy I used for Taonga within my 1997 paper was the flight path of a native bird called a tui, or a kōkō, because of the sound it makes, kō, kō. Anyway, this tui is also referred to as stitching. And when you watch the flight of a tui through the bush, now you see it, now you don't, now you see it, now you don't, as it dives in and out of our tall native bush canopy. And it seemed like an appropriate metaphor to try and explain the trajectory of our taonga, our ancestral items of importance, as they travel through the generations. They would often be stored in the burial caves with the bones, but every once in a while a child would be born, and that taonga that represented a particular ancestor up in the caves would be fetched and given to that child, because it was seen that that child carried the essence of an ancestor from 4, 5, 6, 7 generations ago. And for that lifetime, that child would wear that taonga and then become a man or a woman and then pass away. The taonga would return back into the cave along with those bones. So it was a cyclic returning back to source. So spiritually, we return back to Sky Father. Physically, at a subatomic level, back into the earth, we return back to our mother. And we reintegrate, we start over. So the tui was, could say, weaving between the two. And that too is the taonga, weaving between the two. Now you see it, now you don't. And when you saw it at its most dazzling brilliance and brightness was at the time of death, at the time where someone who had worn that taonga or was associated with that taonga, the taonga would come out of private space and would be laid onto the body, the person laying in state. And then that taonga would become the portal, the window for communication and discussion with the ancestors that taonga represented, and asking those ancestors to help guide the newly deceased back to the spirit lands on that journey of disintegrating. And then a year later, we have the ceremony of the scraping of the bones. And at that point, the bones then disappear into the caves. The decomposition of the flesh has dropped back into Papatuanuku, into the Earth Mother, and then we come out of mourning and we move on, and that taonga might disappear back in the caves, might not. More recently, they tend to go back into museums. They've become a really good place to keep things, what we call tapu, restricted, respected, a discipline, maintaining a boundary around those taonga, not unlike grave sites. You have a boundary. One side, it's every day, you cross that threshold, now you're in the space of the ancestors, of death, and particular way you respect those ancestors. So for our culture, we don't take food or anything of every day into the space of where our burials are, be it the caves or now with Christianity, the gravesides beside, the graveyards beside churches. We maintain that communion with the ancestors, and then when we step back across the threshold out into every day, for some tribes they'll wash their hands or sprinkle themselves with water, something just to signify passing through that boundary. For my tribe, at least when I was young, it was food. We'd eat some food to bring us back to everyday nor, as we would call it. So the taonga in question is the cloak parirotatu. And unlike other taonga, this taonga has had a really interesting trajectory, and it's one that we can compare to a comet. So when she was not a comet, she was actually a bunch of dogs that belonged to a bunch of chiefs that got killed in a big battle, and they're Ngāti Rangitihi people. And one particular chief, Taonga, killed at the Battle of Pukikaikahu. His dogs and all his family's dogs were ritually slaughtered, and this cloak was made, Te Kahu Mamai o Parirotatu, the cloak of pain of Parirotatu. Parirotatu being a kinswoman of Taonga, the tribe having been stripped of their male leadership, she made this cloak, and then she travelled a great distance to another great war leader, and wearing this cloak sat on his marae over in the King Country area today. And eventually Tukurehu, the father of the Rewi Maniapoto, took the cloak off her shoulders and put them onto his. No words said as she sat on the marae, just knowing that in taking that cloak off, he would do his duty of rebalancing the debt that had fallen on Ngāti Rangitihi. In due course, Tukurehu talked with the tribes of Tūhoi. They returned the heads that had been taken, and marriages occurred, and are now both those tribes brought together in marriage. Meanwhile, the cloak now goes on its own trajectory, or her own trajectory. So down to the son, Rewi Maniapoto, and about 50 years later, he then gifts it to Ihakara Tukumaru of Ngāti Raukawa, and that gift was as a baptism gift for the birth of a child, who then, when he grew up, he then gifted it to Poihipi Tukairangi of Tūwharetoa. So the cloak starts to travel quite a bit and starts to have more and more prestige with each transaction. And with each transaction, not only is the cloak gifted, but also the narrative around what this cloak represents. So the cloak's becoming more powerful, more restricted, more tapu. And then in early 1880s, the person called Gilbert Mayer Tawa raised amongst Māori families now a crown agent for land purchasing, but known well to all of the Māori leaders because of his ability to fight and his respect from being in warfare, as well as also being a great interpreter. And they pleaded with him to save their most important lands of the Ngāti Tūwharetoa people for future generations, and they presented this cloak to him along with the narrative. And with presenting the cloak and the narrative, Gilbert Mayer wrote them up. He was also known as Tawa by all of his Māori name, born in a place called Tawa Tāwhiti in the north. And Gilbert Mayer in 1893 then presented his whole collection to the Auckland Museum, over 400 taonga that had been presented to him or he had acquired in whatever form during his time as a land agent. The Auckland Museum held on to this taonga, and then in mid-1980s they did a exhibition tour of the provinces, and this cloak was part of that exhibition tour, and it arrived at Rotorua Museum, and the great-grandson of Pari Raututu climbed over the ropes, lifted up the cloak off the mannequin and put it round his shoulders, sat down and started crying. So that occurred about 2 years before I started my job at the Rotorua Museum. I'd barely been in the museum 3 months, then he came and knocked on my door, over 80 years old, told me the story, then showed how my whakapapa, my genealogy, and his genealogy, very closely related. And you realise then you had just been passed an obligation that was going to be a real test for me coming home and working in my grandmother's museum. So what occurred next was in 1993, after 3 years of pretty hard out negotiation with the Auckland Museum, we were able to bring the cloak back home. And when she was brought home, it wasn't just a cloak anymore, it was Pare Raututu. So all the speeches were to her as a living person before us. And on the completion of the speeches, Harry Simmons, the great-grandson, then knelt down before the cloak and let his tears just roll over the cloak, and then he pressed noses with the cloak. He died about 12 weeks later, and it was our honour, the whole of my tribe, to carry that cloak and lay it on him during his death ritual. And so some of that I talk about in my article. Then we bring the cloak home at the end of the death rituals. After all the ceremonies are finished, quietly place her back into the museum, out of sight but not out of mind. And his children now act as the guardians and always reminded the museum how to manage their grandmother appropriately. So from time to time, she comes out of the museum and gets to be used still in a living practice of death. In 2004, the family knew that I was doing an exhibition, the Kōtawa exhibition, and I was very keen to ensure that we had a balance between male and female elements. And given my relationship with Pare Raututu, I approached them and asked how they felt about her being a main participant in the exhibition and to travel around the country. And they were very supportive and just about went to all the venues as well as the exhibition proceeded around the country. So it started at the Rotorua Museum with us presenting the cloak from the family back to the Auckland Museum. Then the Auckland Museum was received by the tribe of Auckland Museum, who then took the cloak and all the other taonga down to the Wellington Museum of Te Pātaka. And so Ngāti Toa Rangatira, they then received the cloak and the taonga, the home people. And of course, there's other tribes also represented in this exhibition. So very clear who are the visitor and who are the hosts. And so we start to have this practice where the host museum and the host tribe, hand in hand, co-produce the venue for the arrival of an exhibition that's travelling through their lifetime, be it for 8 weeks. Some museums refuse the exhibition because the responsibility of carrying 28 other ancestors not from their region, and the thought that if one went missing while on their land was too much to bear, because they knew if any one of those taonga went missing, that it would affect their descendants for generations. Whereas on the other hand, the museum was worried that we didn't have enough insurance, that there was no glass cases, people could touch them, and what happens if one went missing? Our insurance premiums might go up, but another financial year rolls around and everyone's happy again. So there was quite an interesting, when the museum at Auckland Museum came to realise just how serious each of the venues' local kin groups took the responsibility of receiving these taonga, they started then to realise that the chance of any taonga going missing on any of the museum's watch was fairly low, because the museum's local kin groups, in some instances, arranged so there were people sleeping all night beside those taonga so no one could come in to take them. Always someone awake. Almost like we have in our death rituals, there's always someone awake with the person who has passed away. We never leave that person alone. We never let them not have company through those last 3 or 4 days that they're with us. So the same occurred. And these are just some of the venues as it passes through. So I got to Whakatane Museum, it went over to Sydney, and then back to Opotiki, Whakatane, Rangiowhia, Marai. So on the way through, totally not museum policy, but for some reason the trucks would break down at Marai, and we'd have to stop and figure out what was wrong with the truck. And the door would open, a particular taonga belonging to that Marai would somehow end up on the Marai, and we would have an amazing 2 or 3 hours of that taonga being back into the particular landscape out of the 3,000 plus year trajectory that was still alive through that Marai space. So the taonga, the ancestor, was given the opportunity to be nourished again by the descendants. And then the truck would get fixed, we'd all had a cup of tea, and we'd carry on to the museum. And they say, "Oh, why are you late?" "Oh, we had a bit of truck trouble. We're here now, everything's fine." We stopped at schools as well. So there was some very slightly activistic participation going on. And then eventually we end up back at the Rotorua Museum. So what I'll show now is just a few images from the trip. So this is one of my uncles, bless him, Uncle Hapi, now passed on. And you'll hear his voice later on. And he's there providing prayer over Pare Rautatu before she goes on this big journey around the museums and across to Australia. And as has always been the practice, our ministers are also our tohunga, our spiritual leaders. So depending on the situation, you'll use the particular prayers that's required, whether it's prayers from the old world or prayers from the new world. So in this case, you're travelling in trucks, we'll give you Christian prayers. And then we have the daughters, and it's a very well-known whakatauki, a proverb that we use. ko te rangateratanga o te wahine ne he atawhai ki ngā tangata o tōna iwi. The leadership of women is demonstrated through kindness to all people. So this aspect of service through the women's space. They were a fairly emotional group. And that was one of the times we stopped at a Marai. So she came out. And the great-great-granddaughters got to wear her as well. To this day, you're the only ones that know that. No, so, oh shit, did that. Forgot about that. That's right. My director, he's passed on now, Rodney Wilson. He knew something was going on, but he turned a blind eye, thank goodness. He had other more important things to do, like opening a new museum. And just to the right there is my uncle carrying Tutanakai's flute, Muri Rangaranga. So the flute was also one of the collection. So coming back into the Marai, so one of the receptions from children and our people at Tamati Kapua, as these ancestors come home. And that's how the Pareraututu looked inside the exhibition. So this display, a team of us, mostly Māori, well, pretty much all of us Māori. Then we co-opted some Pākehā and made them Māori as well. And the idea was to throw out all the old rules of museums and start again. How would we do a display of our ancestors from a Māori perspective? So the very first thing, everyone said, let's not push them up against the walls. Can't do that. Second thing, let's ensure that the ancestors are above us, not below us, so that they've got a sense of presence. Third thing, no glass cases, please. Fourth thing, let's not have the clutter of labels. Fifth thing, why can't we have the voices of our ancestors wrapped around? Heck, let's make it like a canoe travelling through time, but that's too literal. Let's make it like a wakahuia, a treasure box, like the ancestral treasure boxes our old people used to have, shaped like almost like a small canoe, but they used to live up in the ceilings, away from the mischievous children, so they couldn't play with the taonga sitting in them. And let's just imagine that taonga, that container has been brought down from the ceiling, and we can peek in and see what's going on there. So the idea is to try and create that sense of peeking into a feather box type container. So not too literal, we didn't want to be too literal. And then we had those projections all come out through the plinth, and they project the landscapes out of which these ancestors directly come from. The ancestors themselves are ordered, so each is genealogically related to the next, to the next, to the next, but we wouldn't dare put the one at the front with the one at the back, because they'd start fighting. So we had to think about how our ancestors were in relation. Yeah, and sometimes they had to do a couple of times, we just had to shift them around a little just to make sure everyone was happy. Along the sides, the gunnels, we have beautiful native wood, and then we had images all the way along of the elders today that are doing the songs and telling the stories, but just their images of the different tribes relating to the different ancestors, to the different landscapes. And then we have the sound of the songs, and then the whole idea was to have the people pushed against the walls so that the people become the object and the ancestors are to whom we belong. So it was you can imagine how the museum took that. Oh. So we had to, and at some stage the museum woke up to the fact that there was some heresy occurring within their ranks. But by that time I had every department throughout the whole museum participating financially. And we'd gone from just being in a little back room to being a international touring exhibition. And the chief financial officer, he led the charge to get this shut down. But the rest of the executive team, apart from the director who was watching his new museum being built, they'd already committed and were supportive and just loved it, because in a way, not only was the descendants of these taonga the co-producers, but also the executives and the bureaucrats became co-producers in the making of this exhibition. And that was probably the most powerful thing that it could have occurred, was for me just to sit there, financial officer having a crack at me, and then all his teammates turned around and had a crack at him. I didn't have to say a thing. So the exhibition did go ahead. And it was for 3 years, travelled through our time. During that time, as we move into a fourth of 5 parts almost finished, we had a major tragedy. And that tragedy was, while we're preparing for the exhibition, was this house named Tūtanakai. Tūtanakai was the original child having the baptism rites being performed on, where the flute comes from. And the house that represents him now was firebombed by one of our descendants of our village. And so our house was badly burned. And so we rescued though the koro, the old fella, out of there, brought him out, and the community knew it would take 2 or 3 years to rebuild the house. And in a way, this crisis brought the community back together in a very special manner. And the koro got to go on a international tour with Ko Tawa. So you'll see him, if we go back, that's him at the front. So he's there from the community, not from any of the museums. And they're actually, underneath his collar there is also a heitiki that also came from the community. No one ever knew that heitiki was there. It's a beautiful translucent heitiki or carved ancestor around his neck. And then the cloak you see on him now was a cloak specially woven by the female descendants of the village where the burning had occurred, to wrap around him to keep him warm over the burnt cloak that he had underneath. So you can see him just there. See how badly damaged his clothes were, but he himself, no damage. So he somehow survived, despite the horrendous damage done internally in the interior. So our crisis is simply cross-generational state dependency. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren growing up in the cities now don't have access to someone like my cousin here on the left, of old world knowledge that have been carefully passed to him when he was a grandchild. And these young people growing up in the cities have, their heads are filled with other ideas, other values, some good, some bad. Our gangs, Māori gangs, are prolific in our country, the violence that still continues. A lot of people thought that with Māori moving into cities, they'd leave behind the impoverishment and the family violence that was associated with our people. But as we've moved into tougher times, then the poor are getting poorer, we're seeing a lot of that lack of well-being coming forth again. And Māori, though they make up only 15% of our population in New Zealand, which is a big amount compared to North America, of course, but we make up, on the negative social statistics, over 50%. So the Māori problem is a New Zealand problem. And so there's a group of us Māori who, I guess you could say, we've been fortunate enough to be in a position to assist, who are doing what we can to not let those kids, like we were when we were kids, go down a track that's almost impossible to get back off. So from a young age, we're trying to find ways, interventions, and positive gaps and directions that will take them forward and be not just contributors to the New Zealand economy, but contributors to their own custom and culture, their values and principles that are barely holding on amongst my generation. So above we have Uncle Happy, and on that day, he died only about 5 days or a week or so after that photograph. And I remember asking him when he was sitting there, had our photographer clicking off photos, and he had the smile on his face, and I just asked him, "Hey, Uncle, what you thinking?" He goes, "Not thinking, seeing the future." Looking out across our marae, across the lake. It's beautiful. And with Pukaki, he continues to go in and out like a tui. So he was back home on the Marai again not too long ago, and then moved out of the Rotorua District Council, where Shiloh's grandfather insisted he went. Shiloh, put up your hand so everyone knows where you are. Okay. He's my squire, where he's carrying my bags, but he'll give me shit for it. And so Shiloh's grandfather insisted, Pukaki, when he comes home, goes into the Rotorua District Council after we've gifted him back to the Crown, back to the government, to remind them of their duty to our tribe and how they kind of not followed it. So in doing that, Pukaki goes up into the Rotorua District Council, quote from Shiloh's grandfather, so he can bloody eyeball all of the people when they come pay their rates and remind them whose town this is. Well, the council managed to get him out of there and back into a museum. So now he eyeballs all those people who pay $15 to come and see him. Though we still go and see him and insist on not paying, so we're okay. So one of the Māori responses, which I was just alluding to before, is using social networking sites, and in particular a program I'm involved in helped set up, and Aaron spoke briefly about it. It's the Māori Maps website, so MaoriMaps.com, and we there assist in the linking of the diaspora of young Māori and not so young Māori, wherever they are in the world, back to their kin communities of origin, back to their marae communities. And we love our proverbs. One of the proverbs that we refer to is he tūporo tere tere. People severed from their land have no direction, or more literally, like a floating block of wood on the tide. So, and this is a famous quote in 1987 by one of our national elders, Māori Marsden, when he compared the loss of land and marae of the Ngāti Whātua people from 600,000 acres down to but a quarter-acre cemetery was all they had left to their name. And he said, unless you can return the marae, your people will become like floating logs. And his words carry on today. And by the way, that's the opening of that marae that was burnt, the house that was burnt. That's it on the opening day. And it was halfway through the Kōtau exhibition. And so one night, the koro disappeared out of the exhibition and had a great day with his family and wider tribe. And then we rushed him back before the museum director noticed he'd gone. So moving forward, this is just a slide I use from time to time for Māori Maps. We talk about new tools of linking, and that's the digital era. But at the end of the day, we're still analogue, so mustn't forget that. We look at the customary values, in particular, kin accountability. How can you respond to your right to call yourself Māori? Where do you get that right from? Through your genealogy. Where does your genealogy link back to? Back to a marae space, back to a kin community, back to all your relations. And of course, it's great to be brand Māori. I have a right. This is my privilege. I can exercise it. I'm entitled. But at the same time, we like to gently also remind them that you have responsibilities to call yourself Māori. You have obligations. You need to make yourself accountable. And most of all, when the time is right, you need to be seen to be in service or know what it means to carry duty to your wider kin. Well, that's what I keep telling myself anyway. So the Māori population, it's growing a lot faster than the non-Māori population. There's a lot of intermarriage, but the white European population is about to become a minority in its own country. The Chinese influx, Asian influx we've had over the last 10 years has been phenomenal. The Pacific Islands growth populations like Māori, it's quite high, like really high. And so we've got to think of what we have before us. And another famous leader, Sir Mason Dury, he talked about the ethics of not responding to the crisis we have would be is not worth bearing thought. So we must respond. How we respond, everyone will have a way. Māori Maps is the way we've followed. So the last part, what does it mean to be a post-museum? I think just a few, I mean, these are just my observations, but I find that museums that are able to recognise their host kin communities as co-producers, that's the future. So the museum in a way becomes a vehicle for conversations, for dialogue, for interchange of values and principles across boundaries which can be negotiated. So who can you seek to assist you in negotiating those boundaries? Well, the host community. It's the land on which your institution sits. And at the end of the day, they've got to carry the responsibility as well. As I said before, not just beyond an annual cycle of financial values, but one of kin accountability values that go for generations. And then you get to the whole source community side. And you know, the host community might also be the source community, but most times the source community comes from elsewhere in the country or somewhere else on the world. So how are you going to be a responsible host and honour appropriately your visiting guest whose taonga are going to be on display on your landscape in this museum? So it's a three-way partnership that needs to be negotiated every time so that there's no room for misunderstanding and dialogue can occur. Well, guess what? Can't be done overnight. It's kind of like that, as Ray Silverman would say, slow museums. Negotiation takes time, but the outcomes are well worth the time it takes. And then finally, the engagement of values and principles associated with ancestral items originating from kin-framed landscapes of belonging. I mean, I say no more. Yeah. So on the way here, Vancouver, I got to visit the Cessnam exhibition, just opened up at UBC's Museum of Anthropology. Highly recommend you go see that. It's actually a venue, 3 venues. There's a venue downtown at the Museum of Victoria, and it's kind of like it's been set up to be a venue for tourists and Vancouverites, and it talks in the voice of first person, plural, to the audience. So you've got this co-production going on. The museum provides the venue, but the voice and the co-curatorship comes from the Musqueam people. Then you go up to the Museum of Anthropology, and here, interestingly, the exhibition is very ephemeral, almost like the words that I grew up with from my elders. They're there to catch if you can hear them, otherwise they just disappear. And so it's on paper, just pinned to the wall. All these wonderful words that have been provided in first person by different members of the community with their authorship beneath each and every one of the quotes or knowledge that's been provided, along with some fantastic interviews. The interviews and the documentary making were done by Jordan and Maya. So they're First Nations. Jordan's Musqueam did the editing. So they've decided on the voice, but they're sitting down with family, interviewing this beautiful film work. And then the third venue is the Musqueam Cultural Centre itself. And here, very different, they provide the space so that the elders can give their voice in first person to their children. So you've got these 3 exhibitions making up, or 3 venues making up this wonderful exhibition that gives you 3 points of entry so that everyone's included, and the boundaries on one hand have been negotiated and obvious, but on the other hand, we're blurring the old boundaries and finding new ways in which to engage. So a lot of light comes into the more exhibition space, and you've got this glass barrier where the exhibition runs out into the landscape. I think it's a very good use of light and capturing the sense of the ephemeral nature of knowledge. And you've made us I think, is a post-museum if your curators have become the object as opposed to the... So we've got Terry, he does belong to Musqueam. He's one of the curators, education. We've got Jason, and of course we've got Sue Rowley. And in a way, they themselves are now the object of the exhibition, and that's been run by the Musqueam. And of course, the visitor can become part of the exhibit. And for me, this is one of the most powerful exhibits I've ever experienced. It's the kitchen table. It's what we grew up with as kids, sitting around, the elders just talking about everything. And you sit down in that room, and you've got 4 speakers, each one representing one person's voice, and they're chatting away about all sorts of crazy things and really important things, but they took things that weren't going to be too private. And then over in this corner over here was a woman's voice. And every time the men went a little bit off track, in came the woman's voice, just to put them back on track, just like our aunties used to. The most powerful thing. And up the top there, one of the, Morgan, one of our hosts, when I go back to Musqueam, there's a little bit of our soul that goes into everything we make. There's a prayer in every stroke, because if you don't believe in it, if you don't put it in there, it won't work. And again, something that one of my very favourite elders used to talk about. It only takes one person not to believe for a taonga to fail. And rather than calling them objects or artefacts or art pieces, this come from a very other way of seeing things as belongings. We belong, they belong, we belong. So if we get those things right, then the past meets the future in the exhibitionary present. So that's my idea of post-museums. And a final picture of some ponies, plural. It's a big shout to Manu. This is the quintessential New Zealand that we grew up with. And still, where I live, we still have horses going up and down a very urban street. In this case, during the Māori maps, it was just really neat to see a whānau family just using the highway, the old beaches. I've written down here, e paora. This goes back to the original picture of the old man that I talked about, Tō Mairangi. I remember him one time saying, e paora, if our tupuna had an outboard motor, do you think they would not have used it? Well, the horses were the outboard motor in the 19th century. You know, and today, we have to maintain our agency, but we can't forget from where we came. So this is one of the challenges for our young people, not to throw away all that has brought them to where they are today, but to find a way in which to integrate that and to rebuild them and weave them together like the cloak so that they can go forward and transfer their knowledge into another lifetime through their children or their grandchildren. So I think I've probably used up enough of your New York time. So very, very much appreciate your patience and acknowledge you being an attentive audience. So thank you so very much to everyone for the opportunity to speak today. Kia ora tātou.
Well, I'd like to open the floor to questions. I'm happy to get the ball rolling. Early on, you mentioned the idea that museums have become good places, in some cases, to keep certain taonga, that they function as a place of sequestration, a safe place, as long as they can be accessed under certain conditions. Can you talk a little bit about the recent historical creation of conditions that make that possible in some cases, relationships with museums, or is that still aspirational, that the museums understand themselves as temporary custodians in which the objects can come in and out as needed.
Well, in my grandmother's museum, it was set up on the understanding of exactly that. So that the majority of the Taonga sitting in the Rotorua Museum are on loan, and from time to time they will be taken out for death retrieval. So it's quite a lot. And that was the only way she could get the Taonga in the first place to start with, coming out of the communities. And she was aware a lot of these Taonga were sitting under beds or under hedgerows where they're starting to fall apart. And from a Māori perspective, everything has a life cycle. They can return back to the land, and once they pass their use-by date, these things will just let go. The Taonga per se, probably arguably the most important Taonga is the knowledge sitting behind it, whatever that object is. And so it's the performance of that Taonga that keeps it alive. Whether it's the recarving of it, the reweaving of it, the singing, the reciting, be it a prayer or a song. But within a museum space, we have a tradition, and I say tradition, in former days, that our human remains of the heads that were carved were sometimes kept in mausoleums that we called whare koi, or bone houses, that lived right beside the chief's house, the rangatira. And within that, the Taonga were kept. And from there, the Taonga would be withdrawn and used for the appropriate occasion, performed in a Marai context. So in the 1960s, when my grandmother established the museum, she invited the leaders of Taonga to use the whare Taonga, or the museum, like a whare koi, as a place where they could be protected, these Taonga. And the plus side was, the museum would pay for the insurance, would make sure they looked after it, have security, so you didn't have children like me playing in the hotatu, and so that they would last further than they perhaps would otherwise. But ultimately, they all have a social life, but they also have a death that's yet to occur. So Pari Rautatu, for now she's sitting in the Rotorua Museum, but at the same time another cloak has been woven by a niece that carries the same name and is now participating in the funerals, in the mourning ceremonies. So that's the Rotorua Museum, and it's probably it's the only museum in New Zealand that was set up with that specific goal. But it's still a local government museum, it's not a tribal museum, so it's really unusual. My grandmother was on council, and she was the first woman on council in the 90s. She was a JP and sat on the bench, and so she had a bit of power. And she was about this high. So Auckland Museum, they are getting used to that idea. They now have on loan some of the Ngāti Whātua and local communities, Taonga in there. And I know that because I'm the trustee for it. So, sorry, Auckland Museum. But just letting anyone know you do that. There's the Te Papa, I'm not sure. But some of the smaller museums, definitely, because they're in there amongst the community. So I'd say it was aspirational, but I believe it's starting to go somewhere else now. The finishing quote I'd use would be from Tō Mairangi when I was young, and we had Taonga like Pari Rautatu come home, and I said, the Auckland Museum still refuses to hand over ownership, it's only on loan. And he just smiled and says, what does it matter? She's come home. So, it's just a legal piece of paper.
Can I ask a follow-up question? We have, I was telling you a little bit about, we have this multi-year project here called Cultures of Conservation, which looks at conservation of objects in museum contexts, but also as a resource for certain kinds of research. And in these cases where, whether it's in Rotorua or in Auckland Museum, have there been cases where discussions around the care and treatment of the objects has brought up conflict, moments for a need of cultural translators in terms of what kinds of actions towards the object might be required in a museological context as opposed to a community context? Can you talk a little about that?
I could use as one particular example, a taiaha, a fighting staff that was in the Curatorial exhibition, and it was loaned from Te Papa under very strict conservation reasons. And anyway, part of the way through the exhibition, Te Papa decided that it was becoming too risky with the dog hair oru that's shaped around the head of the fighting staff. So they called the loan in and said, no, we're not happy with that. Continuing, we want to put that back into our collection, into storage for future generations' benefit. Well, I went down there to have a discussion around this, and a couple of our taumata from York Museum, elders that represent Ngāti Whātua Tainui and Ngāti Paola, the local community, they came down as well. One of them was a Dame Te Aui Davis, and she was on the National Geographic Board, she was on the Historic Places Trust, and she's one of the finest weavers in the country, came from this great whakapapa lineage of weavers, well respected right across the nation. And she sat down there, and the person who told us that this is the reason, and that we, from a conservationist perspective, we can't allow this taonga to continue, and she listened very carefully. And the person telling her this was a Māori conservator. And anyway, Te Aui's response was, well, if you think conservation is to bury that taonga back in the museum, why don't you give it to me now and I'll bury it back in our land? So it's an interesting moment. The taonga continued to the end of the exhibition.
Paul, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about, so many new and really important things to think about. So thank you. It's a great gift. Because of that, I've got lots of things I'm still going to mull over. But one thing I wanted to ask you about was about this wonderful wakahuia model for an exhibition, which I thought was brilliant. Such a good idea. It's, a treasure box is exactly what a museum is, and it's a fantastic way of bringing those taonga to those audiences. And could you tell us more about the decisions that you all made, and about how to sort of bring together your ideas about not wanting to have labels, but wanting to have voices instead, and how you sort of met the audience's probably desires to have some more information about the objects. And did you decide that the voices were going to be talking about the taonga directly, or what did you decide to do, and how did the audiences respond?
We looked at multiple entry points of knowledge. So the primary entry point that we wanted was the descendants of the taonga telling their stories about the taonga. So at every venue we had a huge number of descendant hosts. And a lot of them had grown up in the city that we visited, like in Sydney, away from their home communities for many years. And so to know that their ancestor was visiting meant that they needed to find out about their ancestor and reconnect with that ancestor, and then the pride they had in sharing that to all the visitors, saying, this is me, this is who I am, this is the story about this town. We also provided ephemera. It was a tri-fold out 6-page glossy type pamphlet that provided, you could say, curatorial kind of ethnographic or ethnological information about each taonga, both in English and Māori. And then there was the publication, which then gave in detail about the key taonga in the exhibition, the 28 taonga, which is upstairs. And then a catalogue at the back of all the other taonga. And then we had the website, which was a critical part. So it was the first time in New Zealand we had a taonga database. So it was 2004, so it's 11 years ago. So that people could go online and actually see the images of the taonga. And now Māori maps, we're now linking to such taonga bases, but also back into the communities of origin. It's one of the benefits of Māori maps. Then we also had an education kit that was web-based that then gave teachers explanations of what the taonga meant so that they could, and we encouraged that the schools, before they arrived at the exhibition, that they had already researched the taonga and understood what each taonga was. So that by the time they got there, you didn't need to read anything. You just experienced it. So it was all about creating that emotional tie, whether you're from the other side of the world or you belong to one of those taonga, that was the magic. And the magic for the people from the other side of the world was seeing people belonging to that taonga engaged and getting to understand what it meant to have your ancestor represented through this carving or this weaving. Yeah, so.
I want to reflect a sense of gratitude for what you've brought to us today. I feel like we've all received a great gift in revisiting this way, trying to remove space between the personal, the political, emotional, the historical. A lot of our institutions, I think, subtly and sometimes overtly put that space there, and I feel like it was a tremendous gift to see the way that you've navigated removing that space both personally with your colleagues, with your family, and I should have known that it was going to be quite an emotional experience when I was in tears at the first slide, and it's something that will carry with him quite a bit. So I just really thank you for that.
If there's no more questions, what I'll finish with is a haka and prayer that's provided by my elders at the time that we first started collecting all the knowledge. So wherever we went to about 21 different Marai, and we'd take cameras and, well, first of all, we'd just turn up and say, hey, we want to rock up and we want to do this, we want to do that. And thinking, we're going to get slapped around here, who you Māoris from the city, you young, cheeky. But when we told them we're Auckland Museum, we thought, oh gosh, they're going to jump all over us, saying, you're the ones part of the colonisation of our people. But when they saw that we're Māori, but then we'd always formally meet them, then they'd hear what our genealogy was, and we'd always make sure we'd link our genealogy to their genealogy, or whakapapa. And then by the time we'd finished, it was like, and time again, each of those communities, they said, look, we'd love to participate. And we thought, well, we'll try and bring the taonga back to your community, we can bring images, etc. They said, look, that's fine, but what we want back are our young people, the ones that have gone to the cities and we don't know who they are anymore. Because just about all the communities we went to, the average age was probably 60 plus, and they were shrinking communities. So this was seen as a vehicle to reconnect to their young people living in the city. So the museum, they could see, could play an important role. And as one elder said, this is the first time the museum has turned up in 80 years on our doorstep, a 150-year-old institution plus. He said, it's the first time in 80 years you've turned up on our doorstep. And what surprised me is you're not here to take anything, you're here to give something back. And so that was a nice space. So my direct elder, uncle, he provided this karakia and prayer at the beginning, so that and he travelled with us from time until he passed away. So he was there at the beginning. So if you bear with me, I'd like to finish on that and then let him have the final word, because who am I to not give that to him? And to my auntie Bubbles, whose voice you'll hear as well. So we'll see how we go. This first part is a response by descendants of the taonga, using an all Māori, and they used Indigenous music, and then they matched it with a Scottish descendant. Gilbert may have been Scottish, and they created a whole album of compilation of music, to which we also provided to the, and then we go into Otago Hakas.
kia tātou katoa, kia rata whai ia tō tātou kia ai. Ne te aroha kia kia, ne ki te winga te whane, ne te taki. Āke, āke. Am. Kia ora. You got the copyright on that.
Ka piti horo tātai horo te hongo mata ki te hongo wairongo, ka piti horo tātai hongo tātai te hongo o ki a tātai. Tēnā koutou, kia ora hui hui mai nei tātou katoa. Kia ora.